All right, session 2 here. We're going to be talking about a first base question, a first base concern, the nature of truth. Now, in the rest of the day, it might feel like we're talking about some rather different concepts in these different sessions, but really you can think of the rest of our time together today as an attempt to defend just one simple statement. It is true that God raised Jesus from the dead. That's the one statement we're going to be focusing on the rest of the day, to defend that. Now, maybe you heard in there on your own, or maybe from my gestures, you saw the three-part structure of that statement. There are three significant claims that we have to defend if we want to defend that statement. Yes, we have to defend that Jesus rose from the dead, and we have to defend that there is a God who actually exists, who has the power to take that action of raising Jesus from the dead. But perhaps the element that we've been a little slow to recognize is that we also have to defend the first part of that claim: this is true. That when we say God raised Jesus from the dead, what we are sharing with someone is not just our own opinion about history or our own opinion about religion, but we are talking about something that we are convinced is a fact. It is the true story of world history, that God raised Jesus from the dead. Okay, so it's very important as we are standing here on first base in this session that we clear up this whole idea of truth with somebody if we come to discover that we don't agree on it. And part of the reason for that is because if a person believes in this popular phrase we hear these days, that that's true for you, but it's not for me. If a person believes that that's how the world really is, then he's going to think that he has a conversational trump card that can defeat anything you might say to him. You know, you could talk to him about your faith. You could share with him 15 reasons why he can trust the Bible. You could give him the greatest presentation of those facts that has ever been given in human history. And in his mind, he's going to think, well, that may be true for you, but it's not true for me. Maybe you've even sat through a conversation like that. Maybe you've been at the coffee shop having a conversation with a friend or a relative, and you've been talking about faith, and maybe this is the first time it's come up, and you're so excited to talk to this person about your faith because maybe you've never seen a door open to that before. And you're sharing your faith with them, and you're expressing it with all the passion and conviction that you can. And then when you're done talking, maybe you've even asked that person, what do you think about all that? Or you ask them, do you want to accept Christ? And that person maybe leans back and says, well, I'm so glad that's true for you because I can see how meaningful it is for you. You really believe that, and that seems to make a big difference for your life. I'm so glad that's true for you, but it's not true for me. And with that one statement, they think they have just completely wiped aside everything that you shared with them. And so if we allow them to keep that conversational trump card in their mind, we're not going to be able to make any headway with them. If we were to keep focusing instead on maybe the second base question, the existence of God, or the third base question, again, if we were sharing Scripture with them, now I'm making this statement in no way to denigrate the Bible. Okay, that's not my point in this at all. But if you were sharing Scripture with them, and then they respond with that statement, well, that's true for you, but it's not true for me. You're not going to make a lot of headway with them if you just continue sharing more Scripture with them. Because again, in their mind, they can just dismiss all of that with this thought that it's not true for me, okay? So this claim, on your notes here, this claim that something could be true for you but not for me is called relativism. And it has infected our society at all levels, maybe to a degree that you've never quite realized before. But this isn't just what we find in popular conversation, in coffee shops as people are speaking to each other. We find this expressed by people who really should know better, and yet they still express this thought, especially perhaps when push comes to shove. A great example of this, and this quote here is in your notes, a great example of this would be the majority opinion in the Supreme Court case Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which was a case from 1992. This case is in the whole stream of litigation about abortion. And after Roe versus Wade, this case right here in 92 was the second most important case upholding the liberal position on abortion in our country, until, of course, that was overturned just a few years ago with that Supreme Court decision. But in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the justices found, essentially, we could just say, against the pro-life position. The state of Pennsylvania was seeking to advance certain restrictions against access to abortion, and the Supreme Court struck that down, said that they could not enforce the restrictions that they were seeking to enforce. And Justice Anthony Kennedy, who was on the court at that time, wrote the opinion for the majority, again, the majority that dismissed restrictions against abortion. And at one point in his opinion, here's what he said: "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of life, of human life." So essentially he's saying we are not a people who enjoy liberty unless we are each free to define our own concept of existence and meaning and the universe and of the mystery of human life. Now notice, though, how insidious that thought is, and how potentially appealing that thought is, not only to folks who might want to just live however they want, but even to conservatively minded folks like all of us. Because we might hear a Supreme Court justice say that, and we might think, well, he might be on to something. I mean, I don't want the government telling me how I'm supposed to understand the universe and meaning and the mystery of human life. I don't want the government telling me how I'm supposed to understand those things. And so we might hear that and think, well, yeah, maybe Justice Kennedy is on to something. But his statement has implications that no one is willing to accept, and no one is willing to live by or possibly could live by. Before I get any deeper into that, let me follow this rabbit trail briefly. What Justice Kennedy expressed in that statement is not even the accurate American idea of liberty. Because from our founding fathers, the American idea of liberty was not that we all get to define our understanding of the universe in our own way, or our sense of meaning, or the mystery of human life. Remember, our founding fathers said we are endowed by a creator with inalienable rights. Their point of view was there is a God who has already defined all of those things for us. And the role of the government is to stay out of our way as we live and honor that God. That's American liberty, that the government would not restrict us from exercising our God-given rights. Okay. Well, political science class is done. All right, let's get back to this. But this statement that Justice Kennedy made has implications that even he would not be willing to accept. Because imagine if I had the chance to talk to him after that case, and I said, "Mr. Justice Kennedy, sir, I am so glad that you are open-minded about all of this, because I find it so meaningful to ignore Supreme Court decisions. And so I'm just going to do whatever I want to do and ignore the decision that you just handed down." Now, is he going to say, "Oh, sure, you're free to do that"? No, of course not. He's going to say, "Well, you can't do that. I'm speaking for the Supreme Court. You're not free to ignore our decision." Or imagine if I had said, "Mr. Justice Kennedy, sir, I could see you're an open-minded individual. And I hear you saying that we all get to define our understanding of the universe and meaning and mystery of human life in our own way. So I actually took the liberty of renting out some office space just down the road from the Supreme Court here. And I have opened up what I'm calling the way more than Supreme Court. And we are going to define all of these things in our own way and live by our own rulings." He's going to say, "You can't do that." Or what if I said, "Mr. Justice Kennedy, sir, I find it so meaningful to steal other people's identities and open credit card accounts in their names. So I'm going to open a credit card account in your name, Mr. Justice Kennedy, and I'm going to take the sweetest Cancun vacation that anyone has ever seen. I find that so meaningful, sir. Surely you wouldn't object to that, because you said that the heart of liberty is the right for all of us to define those things for ourselves." Well, of course he's going to say, "I can't do that." So he is not willing to live by the very words that he just wrote. And so that is a giant flashing red warning light that there is something wrong with this thought that he just expressed in his words. Okay, more on that later. All right. But we need to understand the real nature of truth. In contrast to relativism is what we call objectivism or objectivity. Okay, so those are kind of the two competing ideas about truth. Either truth is relative to the opinions of each person, or truth is objective. In other words, it's related to the reality all around us, so that truth is not just left up to the opinions of each person, but truth is defined by the reality that we all share. Okay? Now, this view that if a statement is true, it's true for all people, at all times, in all places, this is called the correspondence theory of truth. All right, that's your next fill in there, the correspondence theory of truth. Now, you don't need to remember that phrase after today. The only reason I mention it is just to get you a little familiar with some of the terms that you might hear if you ever wanted to study this a little bit more on your own. But what I'm defending, what I'm presenting to you is called the correspondence theory of truth. And all that phrase means is that truth is just telling it like it is. That's all. It's just a fancy way of saying truth is telling it like it is. What you have probably always believed about the nature of truth, that's what the correspondence theory of truth is. Okay? That a statement is true if it corresponds to or lines up with reality or captures reality or accurately expresses reality. All of those are just different ways of saying, I'm telling it like it is. Okay, so if I said, it's a bright, sunny morning in Montezuma, Kansas, that statement would be true, right? Because it reflects reality. I have captured the way that the world really is by that statement, right? Or if I said, I had breakfast this morning, that would be a true statement. You didn't know that before. I'm enlightening you about that now. I did have breakfast this morning. So that's a true statement about what happened in the past because it lines up with reality. Or if I said, I have a gloriously full head of hair, that would be false, right? Because sadly, that does not express reality. Oh, how I wish maybe it did. But I've kind of come to terms with the fact that that ship has sailed for me. But that's false, right? That statement is false because it doesn't express reality, okay? So that's all that the correspondence theory of truth is. It's just telling it like it is. And the heart and soul of this way of thinking about truth, which is the correct way of thinking about truth, the heart and soul of it is that we all share the same reality. We all live in the same reality. So if a statement is true for me, if it accurately expresses reality for me, then it must be true for you as well, because it accurately expresses the one reality that we both share. No matter what you might think about your crazy uncle who seems to live in a different reality, we know he really doesn't live in a different reality, right? Because he's here with you in this reality. If you weren't in the same reality, you wouldn't know your crazy uncle to know that he's crazy. We all live in the same reality. So if a statement is true for me, it must be true for you as well, and for everyone else. So maybe you can start to see how it just makes absolutely no sense to say, well, that may be true for you, but it's not true for me. Because what you're saying is, well, that might express the reality that you live in, but it doesn't express the reality that I live in. We all live in the same reality. We couldn't even have that conversation if we weren't in the same reality. You see that? If we lived in different realities, we couldn't even talk about a denial that we don't have the same reality. We all live in this same world, okay? Same reality. So if a statement is true for me, it is true for you. Now we can defend objective truth here with a very simple argument. All right, let me get ahead in my screen here. Let's see, we're past that. There we go. All right, so we can defend objective truth here with a very straightforward argument, with just these two observations and a conclusion that we can draw from them. First, truth is either objective or relative. Second observation, truth is not relative, therefore truth is objective. So in other words, we're just considering these two possibilities, and if we can eliminate one of them, then we know that the other one must be true and accurate. Now, look at that first observation here. We need to understand about that, the first premise, number one there, that first statement, truth is either objective or relative. That is an accurate statement. It is not what we would call in logic a false dilemma. A false dilemma is a logical error that you make when you insist that somebody picks from one of two options, when in fact there are more options that exist. It would be like if I ask you, what's the best soft drink, Coke or Pepsi? Well, there's a whole lot of other options, right? You might not like either one of those. I mean, you think about the whole world of soft drinks. I mean, there's a ton of them out there that you could actually pick from. So if I insist that you choose either Coke or Pepsi as the best soft drink, I've created a false dilemma, telling you there are only two options when in fact there are many others out there. And besides, we all know that Dr. Pepper is the best soft drink. So, just enough with this Coke and Pepsi stuff, right? Dr. Pepper's the best. So there's at least that third option, right? But this statement here is not a false dilemma. When we say truth is either objective or relative, those really are the only two options that exist. We might be able to see this a little more clearly if we think about it mathematically. Because what we're saying is truth is either the same for 100% of people or less than 100% of people. Okay? And those are mutually exclusive categories, and they're the only two categories, right? If you're talking about 100% or less than 100%. Because in this less than category, everything other than 100% is included, right? It doesn't matter if you're talking about 97.5% or if you're talking about 8.26%. Those are all less than 100%, right? So those really are the only two options. Truth is either objective or either it stands apart from whatever everyone's opinions might be, or it doesn't. Or truth is just a matter of what everyone's opinion is, and everybody gets to decide for themselves what's true. So that's not a false dilemma. And the reason why that is so important to understand is because of what I said a moment ago, that if we can then prove that one of these options is false, then in that same proof, we have shown that the other option must be true, since they're the only two options that really do exist, okay? So, observation number two then, or premise two, truth is not relative. We have at least two great reasons for accepting that premise. The first is that relativism is self-defeating. It is self-defeating. What that means is that it does not pass the test that the system itself proposes. In other words, it's like the system says, for a statement to be true, it must reach this level, but the system itself doesn't even reach that level. Okay, so here's a pretty simple example of a self-defeating claim. Look at your notes here. All English sentences contain 4 words or less. All English sentences contain 4 words or less. Now, what's the problem with that claim? Okay, it's false. What's that, Jeannie? It is an English sentence, right? But it contains more than 4 words. So it's showing us that the statement itself cannot possibly be true, right? Because it doesn't pass its own test. The test for being an English sentence, according to that claim, is that it has to have only 4 words or less. But the statement itself has more than that, so it doesn't pass its own test. That's what we mean when we say a statement is self-defeating, okay? And that's what we get when we consider the claim of relativism. So that claim could be stated like this: truth is relative to the opinions of each person. Now, a person who makes that claim is trying to say that's how it is for everybody, right? That's why they make the claim in the first place. And yet, notice, so the claim that statement, or the test for truth that statement holds out, is just the opinions of each person. And yet the person making that claim is saying, my claim is not subject to the opinions of each person. It's the same as saying people don't get to decide for themselves that they get to decide everything for themselves. Well, which is it? Do I get to decide everything for myself? Because you just said, here's this one thing I don't get to decide for myself. So it defeats itself. Or, sometimes we express this thought by saying, you're talking out of both sides of your mouth. You're saying one thing, but you're denying it in the very same claim that you're making. So since the core claim of relativism is false, or since it's self-defeating, the system cannot possibly be true. Cannot possibly be true. Understand that? It's not that old Tim here would just prefer that it's not true. It cannot possibly be true. It can't express reality as it is because it contradicts itself. It can't stand its own test, all right? So then the second reason why we know truth is not relative is that it cannot be consistently lived out. I showed you that with all of my statements about Justice Kennedy, right? He made that claim in his opinion, and yet even he is not willing to live by the implications of that claim. As soon as we start to define our sense of meaning in ways that he doesn't approve of, he says we've gone out of bounds, right? He says you can't do that. You can't create your own way more than Supreme Court. You can't ignore Supreme Court decisions. You can't steal my identity and go to Cancun. And it's mind-boggling that a justice on the Supreme Court apparently could not see that. Because every day that he goes to work, every time he hands down an opinion, he is saying that one person's understanding of reality is going to win the day over another person's understanding of reality. That's what he does in his job. He says, this understanding of reality lines up with the law and the Constitution and all that. So people are not free to live by this other understanding of reality. It's just mind-boggling. And yet, I wonder if that was a position of retreat for him and the other justices that they leaned on in order to avoid ruling against something that they wanted to uphold. Because oftentimes that's the moment when we hear relativism coming from other people's mouths. When push comes to shove and their back is up against the wall with a conclusion that they do not want to accept. Oftentimes then, that's when people say, well, that may be true for you, but it's not true for me. It's that It's that cornered animal response, right? Or the animal in the trap where he's willing to gnaw off his own leg just to escape the trap that he's found himself in. I wonder sometimes if that's the same for people. They're willing to spout what is ultimately nonsense just so they can avoid an unavoidable conclusion. Okay, anyway, a little bit more here about objective truth and how it relates to some different aspects of life. Here's an important thing we need to understand, that even statements about personal experiences or preferences state objective truths. Even statements like that. And that's important to understand because this is where objective truth often gets some pushback. Maybe that pushback even popped to your mind a moment ago when I was saying we all live in the same reality. You know, that we share this same reality. Maybe already in your mind you're thinking, well, yeah, but we all have different experiences. You know, we all have different backgrounds that we grew up in that influence the way that we see the world. So do we really live in the same reality? Well, we do. And even statements that we make about our personal experiences and our personal preferences express objective truths. Imagine if I said, you know, I feel cold. Now you might think, oh, well, surely that's a statement that might be true for you, but is not true for me, because maybe you feel really warm right now, right? I said I feel cold, maybe you feel really warm. But notice, that statement is not a relative truth, it's just a relative statement. The only thing relative about that statement is the pronoun. Okay? Because just think, when I say I'm talking about myself, right? So if we just substituted my name in there for the pronoun, you can start to see how this is actually an objective truth. If I said Tim Erickson feels cold, well, that's true for me, and it's true for you. Because notice, I'm not talking about you, am I? I'm talking about me. I didn't say, you feel cold. I said, I feel cold. I, Tim Erickson, feel cold. And if I feel cold, that's true for me and it's true for you. You couldn't say, Tim Erickson doesn't feel cold, because that would be false. So hopefully you can start to see, even when we're talking about our personal experiences, even when we're talking about our personal preferences, we're not describing different realities. Yes, we might be talking about a personal experience within our shared reality, but that's all it is. We're not talking about completely different realities. Okay, so even when we make like earlier, I said, hey, I love Dr. Pepper. You might not like Dr. Pepper, but I wasn't talking about you. If I say, John Maples likes Diet Pepsi, well, that's true for him, and it's true for me that John likes Diet Pepsi. I don't care for Diet Pepsi, but John does. So if John's who we're talking about, well, that statement is going to be true for him and true for me. Okay, hopefully that makes some sense for you. All right, look at your handout here, because I want to have a little group discussion here for just a few minutes. All right, look at this meme that I printed out in your handouts. I ran across this a couple years ago online, and I thought, man, this is just a perfect illustration of relativism right here. This claim that they're trying to assert in that meme. Now, I want you to imagine that your child or grandchild ran across this online. And now your child or grandchild has come to you and has said, Mom, Dad, Meemaw, Pops, Gramps, whatever it is. Is this right? I mean, this says everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact, but I thought it was a fact that Jesus rose from the grave. Is that not a fact? What would you say to your child or grandchild? Let's hear it as some thoughts come to your mind. Okay? And you can comment about the little drawing, or you can comment about either of those sentences down below. Okay, the resurrection issue, yeah. It is a fact, and Jeanette pointed out even some good evidence to support that fact, right? Because there were many eyewitnesses who saw him. And so they're not just sharing an opinion, and we're not just sharing an opinion. We are holding that on the basis of solid evidence and testimony. Okay, that's a good point there. Okay, yeah, again on the resurrection issue, people came into physical contact with him, right? They saw him eat. They gave him food and he ate it. Yeah, they were able to touch his body. They could see, wow, this is a real body. It's different. It's renewed, but it's still a real body. He really did come back to life. Okay, what else? Okay. They're in the same reality, aren't they? But they're on different sides of this little diagram that is drawn out. And what's the problem here with their disagreement? Yeah, there's an optical illusion here. You know, the guy who's saying 4, on his side, there are 4 endpoints. Do you see that? But on the other side, the guy who's saying 3, on his side, there are 3 endpoints, right? So they're not having, a true disagreement where they're each, sharing their own perfectly valid opinion. That's not what's going on here. They're just looking at different sides of this little drawing. But notice each man is correct about his own side. So the guy who says 3, if he walked around to the other side and counted up those endpoints and still said 3, he'd just be wrong, right? I mean, he wouldn't be sharing a perfectly valid opinion on how many endpoints there are. He'd just be wrong. He'd be incorrect. Okay? So it's not that they're seeing the same thing and each have their own valid opinion on it. They're seeing different things. And if if one of them came around to the other side and still said the same thing he said before, he'd just be wrong. His statement would not be true. What about those sentences, though? What would you say maybe in response to those sentences? And this is open book. Feel free to look back in your notes. Okay, we have to disagree with that, right? That everything we hear is an opinion.
Some opinions do line up with facts.
Okay, some opinions can be accurate, yeah, and in that case, we can just call it a fact, right? But notice these sentences here are self-defeating, just like the sentences that we saw earlier. And the simple way we can point that out is to say, everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Is that a fact? Because whoever is making that statement is asserting it as a fact, right? Essentially, here's the unspoken part of the statement. The unspoken part is that the speaker is saying, here's a fact for everybody. Namely, that everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Okay, so you see how that's contradicting itself, right? So these are just perfect examples of self-defeating statements. Again, here's a statement that's true for everyone, namely that everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. By asserting that claim, you are defeating your own claim. Okay, so those are self-defeating statements. Perfect examples of them. All right. One more important issue we need to talk about in this is the question here, does objective truth completely rule out opinions? Because sometimes that's an impression that people get. They think, well, if truth is objective, then that must mean there are no legitimate matters of opinion in life. But that's actually not true. That's not the case. The objection could be stated like this. I don't remember if I put this on your handout or not, but the objection could be stated like this. Premise 1, if truth is objective, there are no legitimate matters of opinion. Premise 2, but there are legitimate matters of opinion. Conclusion, therefore, truth is not objective. That's how the objection could be stated, but it's actually false because premise 1 is false. Premise 1 in there is false. There are two reasons, at least two reasons, why opinions arise in this shared reality that we all have. Okay, so there are issues that are legitimate matters of opinion. And the reason for there's a couple of reasons. First would be our communication about reality can be vague. Our communication about reality can be vague. In other words, reality is what it is, but sometimes we don't talk about it very clearly. And because our communication is less than clear, it can leave us with a situation where we have a matter of opinion. For example, imagine that I asked, what's the best way to get from here to Denver? Now, flying, yeah, if you can make it flying, right? Okay, but what's the word in that sentence that's a little bit vague? Best, yeah. And so it's a little bit less than clear, isn't it? The question's a little less than clear, and it leaves the matter open to different opinions. Kelly mentioned flying. I might happen to agree with him. Yeah, but we all know there are people who are terrified of flying, right? And so for them, the best way to get to Denver would not involve an airplane whatsoever, right? They're definitely going to want to drive. Or think about people who are driving, We might have different preferences on that. For some of us, we like to stay in the countryside as long as we possibly can, right? Some of us just hate city driving. And so for you, the best way might be the route that keeps you out of the city for the longest. Or, there are those who generously interpret the speed limit. And so for them, the best route might be the route that keeps them away from the highway patrol for, the most number of miles over the route. And so, but notice this. Because the communication was vague, we're left with a matter of opinion, right? And it is a legitimate matter of opinion in responding to that question. But here's what's interesting to note. If we cleared up what we meant by best, we would actually end up with questions that have objective answers. So in other words, if I said, what's the route that will get me to Denver over the fewest miles? And again, I'm thinking of driving here. What route could I drive that'll get me there in the fewest miles? Well, that has an objective answer to it, doesn't it? It might be hard to calculate up. Apparently Google Maps does it for us, but you know, you'd have to do some calculating, but that has an objective answer to it, doesn't it? There you go. Or, again, like, well, what route could keep me in the countryside for the greatest number of miles? Well, again, if you define countryside and you measure that out, well, you could come to an objective answer about that, right? So as long as we're clear about communication, then we're able to describe reality in ways that leave us with objective answers. But if our communication is vague, then we're left with a situation where we can perhaps only have opinions about the question. All right? A second reason why opinions arise is that our knowledge of reality is incomplete. Our knowledge of reality is incomplete. Again, reality is what it is. Reality is not defined by our own opinions. It is what it is, but none of us know all that there is to know about reality. And so because we have gaps in our knowledge, sometimes we run into issues where we just simply have to have opinions. For example, imagine if you'd walked in this morning and on the table back there by the notes, I'd had one of those jars full of marbles, to do a little door prize game. And you had to guess how many marbles were in the jar. Well, you don't know how many marbles are in the jar, right? And so for you and for everybody else, it's just a matter of opinion, isn't it? While you're trying to make your guesses. Now, later on, after I reveal to you how many marbles are in the jar, then you know more than you did before, right? Then you know the objective truth about how many marbles are in the jar. But before that, you all just have to go with your best opinion about it, right? Make your closest guess. Or juries also find themselves in this situation. When a jury is asked to decide if a defendant is guilty of a crime, the reality around the crime is what it is. The defendant either committed the crime or he didn't. But sometimes the jury doesn't have all the relevant evidence, right? Sometimes there are even situations where evidence was gathered by the detectives incorrectly. There were some kind of legal rights violated as they were trying to gather evidence, and that evidence has to get tossed out. The jury can only decide based on what they know about the crime. And they're not going to know everything, right? And so they might have a legitimate disagreement about, well, did he do it or did he not? That's a legitimate matter of opinion if there are gaps in what they know about the evidence. Or we could talk about virtually any political issue, debating public policy. Like if we said, what tax policy will spur on the most job creation? If we were going to talk about that question, we could look at, the basic principles of economics. We could look at the past and say, okay, when the tax rate was this, then that was followed by this increase in job creation or this decrease or whatever it might be. So we can look at timeless principles of economics. We can look at the past. But still, with that question, there are things that we just don't know, right? We're talking about something, we're trying to predict the future, right? And we're trying to predict the choices of free agents, human beings. What choices human beings are going to make. Maybe they won't respond the way that people did in the past when the tax rate was, raised or lowered or whatever. And so that question is going to leave us with a legitimate matter of opinion because we can't predict the future. And we don't know how people are going to choose when they have that freedom of choice, right? And so because we don't know everything about reality, we might be left with a matter of opinion. Okay? But I hope you can see the key point here. Reality is what it is. We just may not always talk about it clearly, and we don't know everything that could be known about it. And so because of that, it doesn't mean truth is relative. It doesn't mean that at all. Truth is objective because truth is just an expression of reality. We just don't always talk about reality clearly, and we don't know everything that could be known about reality. And so there are still legit matters of opinion, even though truth is objective. Okay, let's take a couple of questions here, if you have some questions in your mind, before we head off to lunch. Okay, does anybody have any questions? Mm-hmm. Mostly just to capture the title relativism, because that's how we often hear this presented, at least. Yeah, relativism, kind of the opposite of objectivism. Yeah, but oftentimes when people say, truth is subjective or something, that they mean the same thing as what I meant here when I was talking about relative or relativism. Yep, good clarification. Other questions before we dismiss for lunch? Okay, well, I'm not aware that we're going to be served Dr. Pepper down there, but I have no doubt that there is some good food and drink awaiting us. So, I've talked enough. I've got more talking to do. You've heard my voice a lot. I'm going to ask John to pray for our lunch here, and then we'll be dismissed. And when we get down there, we'll be just ready to go through the line. So, John, would you mind praying for lunch?